The search for truth. There is no religion higher than truth. We all, scientists as well as mystics, Karen Armstrong wrote, know only representations of reality, not reality itself. We deal with the world as it appears to us, not as it intrinsically is. So some of our interpretations may be more accurate than others. This somewhat disturbing news means that our objective truths on which we rely are inherently elusive. We are surrounded by a reality that transcends or goes beyond our conceptual grasp. The remarkable motto, "There is no religion higher than truth," taken from the Maharaja of Benares, can be understood in two ways. One is to understand it as saying that truth is the highest religion. This second understanding might be is that truth is higher than any and all religions. This opens the way to seeing truth reflected in all religions, but also in all philosophies and all sciences. This is the message of the secret doctrine, the subtitle of which is the synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy. What is this truth that is found in the motto? Obviously, it is not simply this truth or that truth, but truth itself. Theosophy addresses this question and deserves our thoughtful attention. Most of us are familiar with the story of the 6 blind men led to an elephant, yet it is worth pondering again. One blind man grasps the tail of this very patient elephant and declares that the elephant is like a rope. Another feels the flank and says it is like a wall. A third puts his arms around a leg, insists this creature is like a tree. The fourth feels an ear and believes the elephant is like a fan. The fifth, handling the trunk, notes that it is really like a hose. And the sixth, running his hands over a tusk, states that it is like a javelin. Versions of the story vary, but the message is always the same. Each blind man has a quite real experience of a part of the elephant and quite reasonably deduces what the elephant is like. We should notice several things here. First, each blind man expresses what he thinks the elephant is like. That is, he draws an analogy between what he knows and what he has just experienced of something otherwise unknown to him. In the language of Niels Bohr, the eminent quantum theorist, the blind man is mapping the elephant in terms already familiar to him. When Bohr said, "There is no quantum world," he was not denying quantum physics, but rather indicating that quantum theory is a map of subatomic reality. Yet, just as a paper map is quite different from the landscape it maps, the theory is a representation of a realm of the nature of which may be quite different from that representation, though there is always a relation between the map and what is mapped. The blind men, at this point in the story, have not had Bohr's insight. They think their statements describe the reality of the elephant. Now imagine these 6 blind men talking together. Suppose they come to realize that they each have a piece of the puzzle of the elephant. Suppose that they determine that each experienced a different part of the elephant, and that they put their findings together from one end to the other of their mysterious object. They mentally paste together a javelin, hose, fan, tree, wall, rope, forming a picture, representation, or map of the elephant. It is difficult to see just what this alleged synthesis of their experiences might be, but it will at best be a very crude picture of a real elephant. With more effort and more experience of the elephant, they may refine this picture, but it will never fully represent the actual elephant that they have each only partially experienced. Maps are only true in the sense of being adequate to our purposes, but they are not the truth. So we learn from the old story something very important. Our experiences can give us glimpses of the truth, of reality, but what we put together from those experiences is, even in the best light, and with our most rigorous efforts, only a picture of what may be quite different in fact. Simply experiencing is not enough. More is required if we are to approach truth. Another familiar story can help us understand our situation regarding truth. It is usually named the allegory of the cave, found in Plato's dialogue, The Republic. We recall that in this allegory, prisoners from birth are chained near the back of a cave. Behind them runs a low wall, behind which a fire blazes. Between the fire and the wall, figures move, but all the prisoners can see are the shadows cast by the fire on the back wall of the cave. They take these shadows for reality, for like the blind men experiencing the elephant, the shadows are all these prisoners have ever seen. If the figures behind the low wall speak, the prisoners hear the echoes bouncing off the back and attribute the voices to the shadows. Plato imagines a prisoner suddenly being released from his chains and turned around so that he or she can see the fire, the moving figures, and the low wall. The prisoner will initially be blinded by the brightness of the fire, but as his eyes become accustomed to this brilliant new experience, he will first come to see this reality and then connect it with the shadows, understanding that they are only reflections of this world he has just discovered. Yet Plato is not finished, for he has the prisoner forced to the mouth of the cave and outside. He portrays his path as rocky and difficult, and so the prisoner suffers in striving to exit the cave. Once outside, he is again blinded, this time by the greater brilliance of the world outside the cave. As his eyes adjust, he sees the world around him, and he sees the sun reflected in an expanse of water. He comes to realize that this world is the source of everything in the cave, and eventually understands that the sun is the source of it all, even of the fire in the cave. We are told that, once adjusted to the outside world, he can look up and briefly glimpse the sun itself, but only very briefly, for if he stares at it, the source, he will be blinded. Having realized the truth, he naturally wishes to inform his fellow prisoners of his great discovery, and so he returns to the cave. But as he enters its relatively dim interior, he finds it difficult to see and stumbles about. When he talks to the chained prisoners, he seems incomprehensible, for the language of shadows is hardly suitable to express the realities he now knows. And of course they test him, finding that he can no longer distinguish between the shadows very well. Plato tells us that if the prisoners could move and seize him, they would kill him. His seeming nonsense threatens to upend their secure but limited world. As Jesus is reported to have put it, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown. We easily see a connection between the blind men exploring the elephant and the prisoners chained in the cave, devising theories of shadows. Both groups believe they are expressing the truth, but we know better. Or do we? Plato distinguished various stages of understanding. There is conjecture or opinion, which is not knowledge. Then there is belief, which a person may have based on some evidence or by some inference, both of which are inadequate to convert that belief into knowledge. One may even have a true belief, but even that is not knowledge, for one does not have sufficient evidence for it. Plato turns to mathematics as examples of knowledge because mathematics has principles of proof which do not depend on transient appearances or changing circumstances. Yet there is something more, something sometimes called intuition, what theosophists call buddhi, direct insight into the nature of things, a knowledge of universal truths. These levels of understanding can be correlated with the stages the released prisoner passes through in emerging from the cave. There's much to think about in these stories, and in Plato's discussion of knowledge. We can readily see why philosophers have struggled for millennia to understand just what truth is. Theosophy provides the answer, an answer that shows both what truth is and how the answer is profoundly important in very practical ways. Unsurprisingly, the answer is so radical that it demands nothing less than a transformation of consciousness and all that implies. To begin to make sense of Theosophy's answer, we need to reflect a little on our ordinary understanding of truth and what is true. We use these words, truth and true, in many ways. A statement can be true or false, and this meaning of true is crucial for logic and reasoning. But we can also say something is true when it aligns with some ideal, as when we say a true man, a true friend, a true case of justice, or a true color, as in a photograph or copy of a painting, or a true breed when looking at a dog, or a true representation, or finally, a true vision. We also speak of a true law of nature when we are convinced that the law actually governs some aspect of nature. A little thought can produce other examples. Within this wide range of the way we use the word true, they all have reference to some standard or ideal. We have that ideal in mind even if we cannot fully express it in words. Those ideals have to come from somewhere. HPB shows us where, but within a context of an even more fundamental conception of truth. Here, however, in our daily discussions, truth has to do with the way things are, and truth is contrasted with error, inaccuracy, fantasy, incompleteness, and falsity. We notice that the idea of degrees is implicit in these examples. A statement can be, for example, inaccurate, but not totally false. Someone says, "It is raining," but in fact, there is a heavy mist. Is this really rain? The statement seems to declare a bit too much. Yet it is not entirely false, for the weather in this case is anything but dry. What we say can be incomplete, a bit fanciful, not quite right, and so on, without simply being wrong. All this is one important point to keep in mind as we think about truth. Throughout his dialogues, Plato refers to ordinary knowledge, and this knowledge, of course, is of truths, and also a knowledge beyond the heavens. That is, knowledge beyond the universe of the senses, hence truth beyond the cosmos of ordinary thought and experience. For Plato, then, there are two kinds of knowledge: ordinary knowledge encompassed by observation and expressed in concepts and generalizations, including knowledge that we would classify as psychology, and extraordinary knowledge that can be expressed only in analogies, symbols, and the myths he develops. When he says, in the letters attributed to him, that he never wrote down his true philosophy, one can see that so-called unwritten philosophy intimated in his myths and stories. We can think, for example, of the myth of in which the warrior is killed, but comes back to life to tell what he witnessed in the afterlife. In this account, reincarnation is explicit, and karma is seen as its cause. In this myth, those whose lives were on balance good are rewarded with pleasant experiences, something like what Theosophists call devachan, while those who tended toward evil are subject to purgation, perhaps something like the astral shells disintegrating after death. Then these reincarnating souls are allowed to choose new lives. But, clearly points out, their choices are hardly random. Past tendencies drive them to choose lives thoughtlessly. Theosophists understand that change and development occurs in incarnated life, not in post-mortem states. And so they choose lives in reaction to their pasts. Rather grimly, notes that those who were wholly bad do not reincarnate, but are consigned to the abyss of Tartarus, forever lost. But he hints in a seemingly obscure and often overlooked passage that those who are pure enough go to a place beyond reincarnation, being freed from this cycle of birth and death. And all of this occurs under the three goddesses of necessity, karma in its cosmic sense. Why doesn't Plato simply state story in plain, ordinary, discursive language? If he did, it would be dogma. For ordinary experience cannot prove immortality or reincarnation, even though such experience can strongly suggest it. Putting these profound ideas into a mythic account, which Socrates, in repeating it, says may not be true, though something like it is, allows the listener to understand what is being said at whatever level he or she is capable of. This approach is completely in line with Plato's insistence on dialogue, that is, on discussion between those seeking truth, so that each participant helps the others come to a deeper understanding of truth. HPB well knew that the idea of two kinds of knowledge, the ordinary and the deeper understanding beyond the heavens, and therefore two kinds of truth, were well understood long before Plato's time. In order to explain the teaching that we know as Theosophy, she drew on the ancient doctrine that forms the basis of what came to be known as Hinduism and Buddhism. That teaching is that there are two truths: the ordinary kind that allows us to navigate incarnate existence, and the deeper truth that is part of our very being. She borrowed the Sanskrit terms Paramarthasatya and Samvritisatya to explain these two kinds of truth. These terms are commonly translated absolute truth and relative truth. In the Theosophical Glossary, HPB wrote under the entry Samvriti the following: Samvriti, false conception, the origin of illusion. Samvritisatya, truth mixed with false conceptions, Samvriti. The reverse of absolute truth, or Paramarthasatya, self-consciousness in absolute truth or reality. There is much to unpack theosophically in these seemingly straightforward definitions of what Buddhists have called absolute and conventional truth. Samvriti is a Sanskrit term that means covering or veiling. Samvriti satya is veiled truth, and in this sense is mixed with falsehood. That is, it is mixed with what is not absolute truth or paramata satya. This distinction, utterly crucial to understanding theosophy, the whole of existence, and ourselves, requires a very large background to be understood. That which has no name or attributes, something sometimes called the absolute or parabrahm, is so far beyond human conceptions that it cannot even be said to exist or not exist, since even these terms imply some limit. The very concept definition implies establishing a limit or boundary, making finite, and that cannot be subjected to any limits. The first thing we can begin to conceive is the beginning of manifestation, and it is metaphorically called the great breath. Still speaking metaphorically, for we have nothing but metaphors and symbols to discuss what are, to us as incarnate human beings, in the fifth subrace of the fifth root race, in the fourth round, this great breath becomes or is reflected in the one life. The one life is the unity, not as a collection, but as one, which is the source of all existence and pervades all existence. The whole of HPB's magnificent book, The Secret Doctrine, as well as her other writings, deals with how this one life emerges, so to speak, the cosmic incarnation of the great breath, and how it gives rise to all the diversity of nature, from the cosmos to the world in which we live. When she speaks of absolute truth in the glossary, she says it is self-consciousness in absolute truth or reality. We cannot think of the emergence of the cosmos as we observe it as simply a material evolution from some material Big Bang. The emergence and unfolding of the cosmos is a manifestation of matter, of course, but equally a manifestation of spirit and of consciousness. The one life is a virtually inconceivable oneness of consciousness, spirit, and matter. Here, and in its unfoldment, consciousness, spirit, and matter are not as we experience them. They are all so ethereal that we can hardly imagine them. The difference that is required to produce the evolving universe in which we find ourselves requires vehicles, or, speaking metaphorically, containers for manifestation. The more universal requires something in which it can reflect itself in more diverse, thus limited, ways. Sometimes HPB uses concepts from the Samkhya Hindu philosophy to give an idea of what this is all about. Purusha, spirit, requires prakriti, matter, to manifest. But matter, essential for manifestation, can only partially manifest that which is reflected in it. Theosophically, this diversity emerges from a preceding unity or oneness, and the distinction between spirit and matter is only relative. As HPB said, spirit is the most ethereal matter, and matter is crystallized spirit. They constitute a spectrum with what we can call spirit at one end and what we experience as matter at the other. But like the white light that differentiates into 7 colors when passed through a prism, due to the different diffractions of the different waves or vibrations of light passing from the medium of air through the medium of the glass prism, the continuum of spirit matter is 7-fold. This spectrum is ultimately the origin of the 7 principles that constitute the human being, everything in nature, and ultimately the cosmos itself. In terms of the one life, while permeating everything, it remains beyond all diversity. Modern science is concerned with the material end of the spectrum at the level of ordinary human consciousness, as it is manifesting in the most material of the globes, globe D. Here is where spirit and matter are, so to speak, in balance. In the outbreathing and inbreathing of the great breath within our solar cosmos, this balanced environment is crucial. For it is in this round that the thinking principle, manas, awakens and makes self-consciousness possible. Given the one life, which is one, what we can call consciousness or intelligence necessarily pervades the whole of existence. It is in the human being, incarnated in an incredibly complex material system called the human body, that consciousness awakens as self-consciousness, which includes a sense of I. Once awakened, self-consciousness can deliberately move through the whole spirit-matter spectrum, from the most material extreme to the most spiritual, awake and knowing at every step of that movement. Over the past few centuries, building on much that went before, science developed a method of understanding the world, centered on measurement of what can be observed and materially manipulated. This method ignores consciousness, and so it is not surprising that the attempt to find the theory of everything, or in respect to the four forces science deals with, electromagnetism, gravity, and the strong and weak nuclear forces, the effort to develop the grand unified theory, have not been successful. Consciousness is involved in observation, in measurement, and in developing theories to explain the material world. Until consciousness is included in the sciences, there will be no real theory of everything. Theosophy is this inclusive science, and it is not surprising that its understanding is quite different from that of contemporary sciences, even while appreciating them. Now one might say that the social sciences do consider consciousness, but psychology, and even less anthropology and sociology, restrict consciousness to its more mundane aspects in human beings. Since consciousness pervades all existence, this simply will not do. Biological sciences have great difficulty ignoring consciousness. But biologists allegedly adhere to a theory of evolution that is material and that occurs mindlessly. Yet when they attempt to explain the physical origins of the various features of different species, they cannot avoid talking in terms of purposes. The bat, for example, developed echolocation so that it could intercept insects at night when its vision is not sufficient for its needs. The eye developed so that species could survey their surroundings, spot prey, and avoid dangers. Butterflies, delicious to some creatures, develop disguises to mimic other toxic butterflies that such creatures have learned to avoid. All this is consciousness language. That is, language that expresses purpose and meaning. This is not a situation that biologists are learning to avoid. The increasingly intricate study of living forms down to the very cells of a body show that cells behave intelligently, communicating with one another. For the human being, this cooperation, the ability to identify and absorb nutrients and expel waste, to detect damage and repair it, is found in billions, some biologists say trillions, of cells that make up the human body, that regulates itself, largely without the attention of the presiding consciousness, which we call ourselves as thinking human beings, without us even being aware of it. Teleology, activity for a purpose or goal, suffuses biological science, and the goal-seeking is a conscious activity. This mutual interconnection of levels of consciousness is true of all existence. But interconnection is too mechanical a term to use when consciousness is involved. Consciousness is not mechanical. HPB put it better when she spoke of brotherhood as a fact in nature. We see it in operation in the world, visible to our ordinary senses, and it is a fact in the invisible world as well. But as self-conscious beings, we have to self-consciously strive to overcome the maya of separateness that seduces us into believing that we are somehow independent when, on a little reflection, it is obvious that universal brotherhood is a fact. The great founders of quantum physics were hardly immune to the insistence of consciousness to be included in the sciences. Albert Einstein is commonly remembered not just for his theory of relativity, forcing reconsideration of space, time, and dimensionality, but also for his broadly mystical thoughts about God. Niels Bohr, Erwin Schrödinger, Paul Dirac, and others could not resist speculating on the possibility of life pervading the universe, of a universal mind, and so on. When they did so, they stepped beyond what we today call science and into metaphysics. It is clear that there is something in the human being that demands more than observations of physical nature and theories restricted to those observations. That something is consciousness itself, which insists on being part of the equation, so to speak, and which already knows there is something more. Hence the need for philosophy and religion. And thus Theosophy is given out in the secret doctrine, points to a synthesis of philosophy, science, and religion, which is true science, true philosophy, and true religion, in the purest sense of those words. And they are one, for they ultimately deal with the one life, looking to the great breath. But everything we've said so far is quite abstract. What has it to do with living life? What are its practical implications? What are its daily applications? HPB puts the answer straightforwardly in the voice of the silence. All is impermanent in man, except the pure, bright essence of Alaya. Man is its crystal ray, a beam of light, immaculate within, a form of clay material upon the lower surface. That beam is thy life guide and thy true self. Since consciousness pervades the whole spectrum of spirit and matter, its development in incarnate existence in the human body is essential. For it is here that consciousness awakens to self-consciousness, and only here one gains the experience that can lead to full realization of what one is, the true self. How one follows the path of self-consciousness to its source, the one life, can be put in many ways. Plato taught that everything has an archetype, an eternal potential and paradigm, which is why, when we see something like a triangle, we can recognize what it is. No physical triangle, drawn on paper or out of some material, is a perfect triangle. But we not only recognize it as a triangle, but we can tell its imperfections. We do this by knowing the ideal triangle. This knowledge is buried deep in consciousness, and so Plato called this recognition recollection, recalling what we know deep within. If we think of less tangible things, such as equality, or justice, or nonviolence, we readily observe them in the world, typically in very imperfect instances. But we know the ideals which they imperfectly manifest. Plato knew that even the paradigms or ideas have a source, which is sometimes called the overarching good, sometimes the true, sometimes the beautiful. This goodness, truth, beauty, called the golden braid by philosopher and novelist Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein, is more than a tightly woven braid. It is the unity within fully realized consciousness, and it is reflected throughout existence. The human being brings this braid to self-conscious existence by discerning truth, goodness, and beauty in the world. The world perceived by typical consciousness is, however, a kaleidoscopic effect of deeper forces and structures, and so is not reality in any fundamental sense. This, of course, is the point of the quotation from Karen Armstrong. Theosophists are taught that existence being sevenfold, the incarnate human being has a sevenfold constitution. William Quan Judge reminded us that all existence unfolds from what he called the one element, its ultimate nature, not seven, but it diversifies and thereby creates the whole panorama of nature, both cosmic and human. Our ordinary physical senses perceive the most material reflection of this diversity. If, however, we are sevenfold in our human nature, there are equivalents of these senses, these modes of perception, at every level. Ensconced in a physical body, consciousness is awake only to the extent that it perceives the physical world and thinks about it. For Plato, our state is like the prisoners in the cave, seeing only shadows, effects, of unseen intelligent forces, beings, in fact, and their activity. The great breath pervades all. The spirit-matter spectrum is ever present. The universal Atma pervades all existence, and we, being sevenfold, are illumined by it. Though in our typical daily lives we do not comprehend that, yet the crystal ray of Alaya is there, and there are times when we sense its presence. These intimations appear as insights, intuitions, realizations, sometimes seen through the surfaces of individuals and events to deeper patterns of meaning. And it is what provides us with our innate ethical sense, our awareness of right and wrong. One can readily observe this in very young children, whose full monastic awakening has yet to occur. Nonetheless, the sense of what is fair and what is not. We sense truths that we cannot put into words, detect unexpressed goodness, and are naturally drawn to beauty. These facts should alert us to the deeper levels of existence that the distractions of daily life obscure. How then are we to become self-conscious of these deeper or higher levels of existence? We are taught that there are two fundamental processes that we must undertake and persistently pursue to gain ever more realization of what is real. One is meditation, focusing consciousness and withdrawing our senses, which means withdrawing from the maelstrom of physical perceptions. In removing the distractions of the external, we begin to gain a deeper understanding. HPB recommended the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which emphasize the process in general but clear terms. And we dwell on the most universal ideas we can imagine, absolute abstract space being one, the real natures of the Mahatmas being another. We begin to raise our consciousness to levels beyond the physical senses and mental conceptualizations. Over time, we learn to focus without distraction and can raise consciousness to ever higher, which means more universal, levels. Each level we have will have its relative truths, and we will need to remember that these are like maps, useful for indicating the level, but consciousness needs to move on. no matter how intuitively insightful some understanding is, that understanding helps only if we do not think. This is it. But be prepared to transcend that insight to greater ones. HPB warns us that moving into territory unknown to our current self-consciousness can be quite disturbing, and we need to resist the desire to retreat to old, inadequate, but unfamiliar understanding. This resistance to change must be overcome at every level of expanding self-consciousness. The second process turns outward, not inward. For unless we orient ourselves in the world in a way which reflects the one life ever more transparently, we will not be able to pursue inner awakening successfully. Quite near the beginning of the Voice of the Silence, we are told that the hall of learning, the intersphere of self-awakening, is filled with beautiful flowers, with wonderful sights, so to speak, but that under each one is a serpent. That is, each is accompanied by something potentially spiritually toxic. We are all too familiar with the distractions of the world, distractions that both attract and repel us, so that we are drawn to this or that ultimately empty object or achievement. These attractions and repulsions that veil that inner sense of something more real, of something more fundamental, that we are already sensed as children. The more we passively give in to these distractions, fleeing what is repulsive, grasping at what is attractive, the less we maintain that deeper awareness. In meditation, we withdraw from all this in order to penetrate the veils that obscure our deeper selves. We must move beyond the subtler distractions of the hall of learning. For the serpents under these beautiful astral flowers are the tendencies we have to be attracted to or repelled by what we witness. We cannot reach toward full consciousness of the one life, which is what we are, if we wander off our focus on it and get sidetracked by astral delights. The astral is also sevenfold, so in meditation we will encounter such distractions at higher levels as we proceed. What then is the outward process? The surrealist writer René Daumal wrote a brilliant essay titled in English, Mount Analog. It is an individual hears of a remarkable island not found on any map. He determines to find it and sails into the unknown. Eventually he does find this island, and landing there, discovers others who have also found it. He learns that to climb the mountain to its glorious summit has a curious requirement. To ascend to the next stage of the climb, one has to return to the lower stage and help another ascend to the stage one has already reached. Only then can one proceed up another stage, and then must repeat the process until one has reached the very summit. Surprisingly, our climber discovers that many people have tarried for years in the community at the base of the mountain, enjoying the views and life there. They seem to have lost interest in the climb. In the language of the Voice of the Silence, they have reached the hall of learning, but have lost the will to move on toward the real goal, which is the summit of the mountain. Of course, we recognize Plato's cave in this story. What is clear from all this is that meditation alone is not enough. We must develop the will to move on in our efforts to reach the very source of our being, the one life itself. But we cannot do this without radically reorienting our relation to the world, which means our relation not just to things, but to other human beings, including even ourselves, and to all events, and to all nature. Every authentic spiritual tradition has taught the necessity of this fundamental reorientation. In the Christian New Testament, St. Paul speaks of the old man dying and the new man being born, welcoming the Christos into one's existence. And he speaks beautifully of the fundamental importance of love for all. In the Hindu Bhagavad Gita, Krishna teaches Arjuna to see Vishnu as the supreme spirit in all things, for it is there, and so it is in ourselves. In Taoism, Lao Tzu urges us to become one with the Tao, the way, and the truth. In Islamic Sufism, the great mystic Al-Hallaj could identify with one of the divine names of God, declaring, I am Al-Haq, that is, I am the real, I am the true. Buddhists point to the necessity of the turning about of consciousness, a profound reversal, so to speak, of our understanding of ourselves and the world. The medieval Kabbalist Isaac Luria used the term tikkun, restoration, to indicate our role as self-conscious beings in the restoration of all existence to its ideal, ultimately real state. However conceived, this is the path that purifies us of succumbing to the distractions that surround us. These distractions, when properly understood, are not enemies, but are lessons to be learned, and they can only be learned through self-conscious and ethical development, the twin processes of self-conscious realization. We cannot approach the one life unless we increasingly think and act as the one life. This means overcoming the dire heresy of separateness, as the voice of the silence teaches. We do this by treading a path that stage by stage reduces viperous sense of separateness. Rather than seeing others as different from oneself, one sees them for what we all are, souls seeking realization of what we really are. Treading this path is not simply abiding by some conventional morality. It is developing a universal ethical sense that responds to reality, not the masks of personality. This ethical sense can be likened to learning how to ride a bicycle. We began by struggling to achieve balance, of using the handlebars to give direction, pedaling to move forward, learning to be aware of our surroundings. All of this is very awkward at first, and as we learned, we sometimes fell off the bicycle or ran into or over things. But in time, with practice, we became one with the bicycle, so that we could do all these things without thinking about how to ride. With this mastery, we use the bicycles, but think of where we are going. We become the path we are treading, for it is ourselves, to the point where our responses to whatever the world gives us is effortless. The path to truth and reality is thus dual, a transformation of self-consciousness and a transformation of our dynamic situation in the world around us. Rather than desperately separating ourselves from others, the ultimate falsehood, we can become centers of beneficence, radiating out to all. The various accounts of meditation and various versions of the path of ethical purification are authentic. They all contain the same requirements and possibilities. The voice of the silence shows that what we might call inner development, the raising of self-consciousness, and the outer development, our life in the world, are one. Though the language is different, one encounters the same teaching in Light on the Path, in the Bhagavad Gita, in the sacred texts of many religions, and in timeless philosophies like those of the Vedantins and the Neoplatonists. As consciousness transcends the illusions of the physical realm, it encounters illusions of a subtler nature, and transcending them, subtler illusions yet. Maya is illusion, but it is also the creative power of differentiation, of diversity, and it is this diversity in which we find ourselves that permits self-consciousness to awaken and expand. One could say that the increasing development of self-consciousness is discerning the dynamic architectonic structure of Maya at increasingly universal levels. Though seemingly paradoxical, extending the circle of inclusion in one's awareness of unity involves going then from, so to speak, the circumference of one's incarnation to the central point of one's being. One comes to realize that this point is like the point in the ultimate circle, whose circumference is nowhere and whose center is everywhere. This is the divine in all things, Krishna in the gods, human beings, and in dogs. This is why the word true is used in so many ways. And it is the movement from knowing that to knowing why through learning to know how. The goal, no matter how distant it may seem to be, is where our inner life and outer life become just one life, where subject and object become one, where all relative truths are replaced by the truth. For one is the one life, without separation from anything, yet transcending all things. In this sense, real knowledge is of the truth, which is self-knowledge, knowledge of the self of all. One is ultimately the good, the true, and the beautiful, and that from which this golden braid arises. One is the truth one seeks. To sum up, we can see that metaphysics, the study of what is, and epistemology, the study of how and what we know, and ethics, how we live our lives in the world, are not three subjects. They are one. For together, they place us in our incarnated existence, and that placement allows us to see both what we can do and what we should be doing. Self-consciousness is the synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy. Theosophy is not some intellectual study, though it involves deep study. Theosophy is practice, meaning it is living the life. Theosophy is practical at every stage of one's understanding of it, for it is practice itself. We can see why forming a nucleus of universal brotherhood has always been the first object and goal of every theosophical organization. It is the reflection of the fundamental fact of nature. Everything is what it is because of the one life, which, when cleared of all illusion, just is. The sacred goal has been reflected in philosophy, religion, and science throughout history, for there is no religion higher than truth. The goal begins with what we call the Golden Rule, found in every tradition, including the sciences, which seek knowledge for the betterment of humanity. The voice of the silence expresses it simply and eloquently. The first step is to live to benefit mankind. The first step in realizing universal brotherhood begins with each of us, consciously and deliberately, by whatever method we each determine, to make the truth a living power in our lives. In doing this, we nurture all existence. Thank you.